Hey folks, before we get into today's podcast, I wanted to share that QCon London returns April 7th to the 9th, 2025. Learn what's next from world-class leaders pushing the boundaries of modern software. You'll learn actionable insights from senior developers working on real-world projects across multiple domains. Learn more at QConLondon.com.
Welcome to the InfoQ podcast. We are live at QCon in San Francisco, and I'm joined by Susan Shu Chang, who's working at Elastic as a principal data scientist. And at QCon San Francisco, she is hosting the track AI and Machine Learning for Software Engineers Foundational Insights. Welcome to the InfoQ podcast.
Yes, thank you for having me.
So should we go over what the talks were which you had in the track and which ones you liked, or what overall foundational insights you were hoping to instill in the attendees?
Yes, yeah. So first of all, very glad to be here. We wrapped up the AI and ML track just yesterday, which was the first day of the conference. With the track, I had hoped to curate various topics in foundational machine learning, because nowadays we're hearing a lot about generative AI, and we do have a track for this on the second day of the conference. But still, a lot of things are powered by these fundamental machine learning, which were also huge topics and still are very, very relevant these days. So for example, when people are going on YouTube or Spotify or Netflix, you're getting served personalized recommendations such as, oh, you might like this, or just the home feed of all these social medias and content sites. That's all powered by machine learning and has been for the last many, many years. So I wanted to cover these foundational techniques and machine learning families like recommender systems, reinforcement learning. We also had talks about machine learning in production, which is one of the main concerns we have, because sometimes, you get a fancy machine learning model, but you're actually not able to run it in production, which is serving users, in which case it's not actually bringing in the monetary value. Yeah. So, we want people to be learning about some of these nuances of getting machine learning in production. Then we also had some talks about knowledge graphs and large language models and how you can merge the two techniques together to build a better experience. So just in summary, I wanted to cover various areas because the engineers here, they're working at all these companies that definitely use machine learning, and they have definitely been adjacent to it or heard of these techniques, but I wanted to help them bring concrete example from people who have been doing it on the machine learning side, but also help them understand just behind the scenes how this is working.
Yeah. So there are, especially, for example, the recommender and search engines. I think the talk by Netflix was very interesting about how to get better recommendations and really tailor them to specific people.
Yes.
That was great. Also, you mentioned the enforcement learning. That was also very interesting. That some people who are working at Meta came up with an idea on how to use long-term interaction as see it as a reinforcement learning problem.
Yes, exactly.
Are there any specific tools you would then recommend to people, or like any specific topic you would recommend someone to look at first if they want to get into machine learning now?
Yeah, I think still, if we're not talking about generative AI specifically, just for the foundational, let's say neural networks and things like that, I still think PyTorch and TensorFlow are still very valid to play around with and get started. And they have a lot of tutorials online too to build an initial end-to-end app. So not just a hello world model or something like that, but rather you might have a model and then you build a simple lightweight web app. So this connects more to what softwares know and are familiar with and how it's actually being done in industry. Because if you just have the model, it's not doing anything, right? You always have to connect to the UI, which all our software engineer partners at my job or at other companies I've been with or in these large companies like Google and Netflix, without the software engineers, the machine learning is not even touching the customer.
Was it in your track that someone talked about how to actually get your model deployed?
Yes.
Okay.
The speaker from Grammarly was talking about common pitfalls that prevent machine learning models from getting into production. And actually a lot of the challenges have to do with finding the right problem and communicating with management and finding the right solutions as well. And that's actually something for me as a principal data scientist I do a lot at work too, which is find out what is overkill and what is more practical. Sometimes we actually really like to start with rules-based approaches in practical machine learning, which is we have now a baseline to compare the model with. If a machine learning model is doing worse than just like a simple rules-based approach, then that means either we shouldn't use machine learning or the machine learning needs to be greatly improved, in which we would really need to go back and see, is the resourcing we're spending on this even worth it? Is the ROI worth it? Things like that. So early stages, we actually really focus on some of these, like, it's not technical per se, it's like these rules and business logic, but it's essential so that we don't waste millions of dollars like down the road if we're solving the wrong problem.
Yeah. So do you think that in terms of AI and machine learning, nowadays there's a lot of tools on the market, especially with this Gen AI, everyone can call the GPT-4 API now. Do you think it's still good to have a prior knowledge about AI and machine learning specifically, understand how these models work? Or do you think it's kind of now open to everyone?
I think it's more open to everyone now. So one example I was giving to attendees in the unconference that we did. So the unconference at QCon is a kind of an open session where people can come in, they put up the topics they're interested in, and then they go into groups and discuss each topic. So one of the examples I was giving in the unconference topic, which was, I think, how software engineers are evolving in the landscape of ML. I forgot the exact wording, something like that. But one example I gave was that our company, we built an AI assistant. So this is kind of like a chatbot, and people can bring their own API key from a vendor like OpenAI or Anthropic or something, and they can put that into the Elastic. Let's say they're using the cloud version of us. They can put the API key in, and then we have the chatbot which will answer questions about the Elastic product. So we're not in the business of competing with OpenAI, right? It's like a collaborative thing where the users are using OpenAI and us. But the engineers were able to basically build out the MVP completely by themselves because they can just handle the stack, and then they can handle building the connectors to OpenAI, right? Like calling. So they can build all of this completely by themselves. Where we come in more so is regarding, let's say, improvements or evaluations. And if we had to do fine-tuning, that's also where we would probably come in as well, which is scenarios which involve opening the black box and kind of tweaking things. The reason for bringing up this example is that engineers can build a lot of things without knowing exactly the internals these days. Like it didn't used to be like this. And I think this is a good direction. Like I'm very excited about this.
Yeah, but do you have the feeling that if people don't understand what's really happening, that it's kind of setting them up for failure? So if someone doesn't understand what an embedding is, then maybe the retrieval augmented generation becomes a bit harder. If you just treat Elastic as a magical black box, which gives you some random documents back.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think that's a good way you put it, which is it's easy to build an MVP. It's difficult to debug unless you know how it works. So I think that's where it's important to know about the fundamentals. It's important to know about how these various tools and techniques are working. Yeah, so it's for if you want to tweak, tune, and debug, that's where that comes in. MVP, simple, I think.
I think in general, often in software, the MVP is easy.
Right,
Actually, getting it to deliver value to your customer seems to be the harder aspect.
That is true.
So given that you work at Elastic, are you then mostly working on tools for generative AI or other aspects as well?
There's a mix. Myself and my team own different types of use cases and models. So I'll share briefly a few of the cases we have. So one is we ship supervised models that people can run on their data that is in Elasticsearch. So we do not have access to Elastic customers' data. So the way we were training these models is through our own data gathering, and then we will train the models. So because of the Elastic Common Schema, we know that the customer's data, if they're ingesting it in the Elastic Common Schema, the data will look exactly like this. The field names will be exactly this. It'll be in this format. So that's how we're able to ship these models, train them on our end, and then we ship them downstream so the customers can use it on their environment without our involvement at all. So that's thanks to the Elastic Common Schema and the fact that people love to ingest their data into Elastic. So that's one part that we own. And the other part is augmenting the AI assistant piece. So as I mentioned that the engineering team were able to build out the AI assistants by themselves, and then we'll conduct tasks like evaluation or research R&D into what other functionality can be added into this. Like we have to prove out that it actually works before we can add it into the product.
What do you mean that you have to prove that it works? How do you prove that it works?
Yeah, I can share one proper example that myself and team have blogged about. So I'm just thinking of the public example where we use large language models to conduct session summarization. So a common way people use Elasticsearch is to ingest logging. So we have observability vertical as well as the security vertical. So this is because people ingest logs into Elastic. So the data is complex, right? So we'll have these large JSON objects, which might have information like command line logging or performance logging and like what user are you, what host are you. And we wanted to see if large language models are able to understand, like given a stream of logs, like is there any, let's say, what did the user do in this session? What did they do? So we did an R&D project where we grabbed like real logs that we had, and then we did some data preprocessing. We tried different ways of preprocessing the data. We fed basically these logs to a large language model and see if the large language model is able to summarize from these logs that maybe the user SSH'd into here, they ran these commands. What did these commands do? They're not just
these
spitting
logs
it out.
can be extremely large, right?
Yes, exactly.
So the context window has to be very big as well.
Yes. That's one thing we had to do. We did a few things to narrow down the content that we're feeding into the language models. So at the time, of course, like I think 4.0, we're using GPT 4.0.
Yeah.
And then that had like a larger window. Oh, and we tried like the Gemini one, which had like a huge, I forgot, 1 million, was it? Yeah. It was like, we also tried that. But actually, it didn't mean that it performed better. We had to go back and extract, let's say, relevant fields. So we noticed that some fields were they're not super important, or they had repeated data. Like we had, a simple example is, let's say we have timestamp or some sort of like beginning time or whatever. Like we can like deduplicate some of those, as well as some highly repeated events. If it made sense to consolidate them, then we would have to consolidate that. We didn't spend too much time on this. It's just like very first pass, like heuristics and things like that to narrow down what we're passing into the language model. And how we evaluated this was we had a subject matter expertise. Like we had a security researcher. They would summarize it in the way that they would normally summarize it. Like what is the relevant process here? Like what is happening in this session?
As in they would summarize what the user did in the session.
Yes. Using
in natural language.
Yeah. We had a bit of almost like a survey. Like what did you think that they did? Or what do you think was the relevant piece in these logs? And things like that. And then we compared that to the response that the large language model was giving.
So interesting.
That was interesting. I would say right now it's still just an R&D project. We are not like merging it into the capability at this time, but I don't know, like we might revisit it in the future. But these are some things our team does, which is we'll, run these research experiments and then we'll do evaluations and then we'll see, we might have a few on the docket that are in various states of maybe being in the product. So I'm just sharing this one that we have like shared about publicly. But it doesn't mean it'll be in the product. It just means that we have tried this out and we've like learned our lessons from it, because actually this project, we kind of created a template for the evaluation. We were just using that for the subsequent projects. So it's like very repeatable.
Yeah, and also the AI tools and the AI methods are going so fast nowadays. It's really hard to know what the next big thing is or how you have to adapt your database to make search work faster. Or better. It's quite difficult. Are there any specific algorithms or tools which you would recommend people to start with if they are starting with machine learning, or anything specifically they should try?
I think these days for creating some Gen AI like MVPs, I think a lot of people starting out, they're using the tools like Streamlit. So that's like I guess it's a very, I don't know how to describe it. Like
it's like a front end for Python.
yeah. Like very abstracted like front end where they put all the boilerplate into like wrapped it all up so you can
like
create
serving of your function as a website.
Yeah, exactly. So people can create like a interactive chatbot with like a few lines of code. Like it could have a drop down for some basic responses or built-in templates, and then you can have like a input box. I don't know how it is in web dev terminology where you type.
Yeah. Like sd.input.
Okay. Yeah. So and then the outputs. And you could do that real quick. Like we can use that for actually in industry, like people who are in ML, they might use that to spin up a real quick prototype real fast. Like it's not pretty, it's not scalable or whatever, but it's just like to demonstrate how it might look to someone. Let's say we're communicating to like a product person. We want to, it's better to show them with that rather than like, let's say it's outputting some like JSON, like showing them that is like a bit less like tangible.
Yeah, and also convincing other people to run a Python script and have the right dependencies always takes more time than just sending them the URL to your local Streamlit.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so that's a tool I think has been useful. Really, it's more like at the toy, like, learning, right? But it's like, got to start somewhere. Yeah. Not building like some gigantic end-to-end for your like learning project. Like definitely not.
Yeah, no, it's I also use it quite a lot. I really like it. Any other tools you recommend then, or?
I think that's the main ones. Like, because I think just like, let's say if we set aside Gen AI for a second, right? In the past, I would recommend people run anything of their choice. Really, they could run like. I'm talking more about the Python stack because that's where, I work mostly in, but, just pick your own thing of your choice. But I would recommend people, let's say they can spin up something with Django, they could do Fast API, they could do like Sanic, like whatever. Like there's a few, sorry, I got loud, but just like there's a few, pick one you like, and then just like try building a simple app with it. It's a bit more, complex than just like, let's say using Streamlit, but it's the same concept, which is you understand the machine learning inputs and outputs, and that helps so much with people learning, like, how does this fit into the entire infrastructure?
Yeah, and then also that way you can really have your Python function finally as a service or like as an API people can call.
Yeah.
That's quite nice. You also wrote a book, Machine Learning Interviews. How did you come up with the idea to write that?
Yeah, so this is an interesting story. I guess I'll try to keep it briefer, but so I was doing an online course for O'Reilly, as I mentioned. So it's a live course. So I answer the questions live.
Yeah.
And the topic was around machine learning interviews. So it's to help people that are quite new or they just want a quick refresher. But I guess like the main target is to people who are either, let's say, new grads or career transitioning. And I was running this live course. It seems like it was doing pretty well, like on high ratings. So then the publisher asked if I would do a proposal for the book. And actually, initially I said no, like I'm kind of busy. I'm not like putting in a proposal. But then after some time, I eventually did go back and create the proposal. I think sometimes for different topics, they might have various proposals at a time. So let's just have a simple example. Like let's say they're looking for a topic on orchestration or whatever, right? They might have some people who have different proposals all on orchestration. So of course they can't always like accept all of them. So they have to pick the one that maybe fits the best at that time for them. So then I was lucky that mine was selected. So I set about writing the book. It took me a year. And I actually do really like writing.
Did you spend a week full-time a year on it, or did you do it all in your spare time?
Spare time, spare time, yeah.
Very impressive.
Yeah, I think it's a lot of time management. So like 3 to 5 hours a week, sometimes more, sometimes less. But I would say, like I'm more like a slow and steady person, which is I just do a bit. And I prefer not to crunch on the book. So it's like less stressful. But it was a lot of time management and energy management too.
Yeah, interesting. So if people are listening to this and they have an interview upcoming, is there a fixed set of skills nowadays which everybody needs to master? Or is it still, does it depend on where you're applying and what kind of machine learning job you're applying for?
Yes, it's very dependent. So one of the things I was going for with the book is I first start with describing a very general machine learning life cycle and workflow. So you might start with the raw data, and you'd have the data pipelines that are coming in. You would have then, let's say, model development, and then later on you would have the model deployment. So given this simple life cycle or workflow, the jobs will be corresponding to one or more of those responsibilities. But one thing a lot of job seekers, and even I had made this mistake before, was I might search online for, let's say, machine learning interview. And the same article with the title machine learning interview could cover something about ML ops. Yeah. An article online called machine learning interviews could be covering stats and probability and those, classic algorithms. They could also be covering stuff like data analysis. And so people might think, oh, I must prepare for every single one of these. But the fact is, it really depends on, in the job description, what part of the life cycle the job is targeted towards, and then prepare for that first, prioritize those questions. So this is what the book covers, like how do you select what topics to prioritize, and the main machine learning algorithms, the main general like ops skills and tooling that are common in machine learning, and so the responsibilities of the various roles. Yeah, because I mentioned that it's targeted towards beginners or people who, actually there is a funny thing in ML, which is people who are experienced, depending on what kind of thing they were doing, they might still want to read this book. And I've heard people do that. Like they still found the book helpful, even if they're already working in ML, which was, I wasn't surprised, but I also was a little bit surprised because people transition between model training to just more on the software side, back to model training, to more data analyst, to back and forth all the time. So they want to know what they should cover in their interview.
Yeah, but I think now I'm going to go on a rant, but it can be kind of frustrating that if you are a software developer, you know that you will have some kind of lead code interview. So you can practice lead code and then you're probably set for the next 20 years in terms of skills. The machine learning field is rapidly evolving and is growing and growing on a daily basis. It makes it harder to really learn the skills. Also, one of my favorite things is to interview people who have been in this field for forever, because they always have very different answers to questions you ask compared to people who just graduated from courses. Are there any questions people frequently ask which you hate, where you're like, you should just stop asking this doesn't add any signal to your, or any value to your interview process?
Ooh, I think one mistake that might be made is focusing maybe a lot on the specific tooling. So when I'm reviewing resumes and when I'm the interviewer, let's say they mentioned they use PyTorch. So in my mind, I'm literally equating that to TensorFlow and some other tools. But then I think someone who focuses too much on the exact tooling, they might hear, oh, you didn't use this, so maybe it doesn't count. Or there was some of those data warehousing tools, like let's say you're using Presto or some other things. I forgot, Teradata or this was a few years ago. So it's like some other tooling that was like hot at the time. So like if you use one of them, you use all of them. Like you can go from one of those to BigQuery like immediately. You don't need to learn BigQuery. Like you just need to write SQL, and you can write it anywhere. It can be written, and you're good. So I think someone who cares a bit about those, like it's like not super helpful for finding the right candidate. Like it limits the pool unnecessarily.
Yeah, okay. So the tip is to not focus on specific tooling, but focus more on the generic skills.
Yeah.
And then maybe as a last question, if there are companies who are setting up their machine learning interview, do you have any tips for what questions they should ask or what they should focus on or how they should structure the interviews better?
Yeah, so I think it's really, really, really important to know what skill you want to hire for. So I mentioned the kind of general machine learning lifecycle with like, do you want this person to be doing maybe the early steps of bringing the data in, so more like data engineer type questions, or do you want them to be focusing on the model training, or let's say like with Gen AI, it's a little bit different, but just like, let's say we're focusing on ML model training. Like if their primary responsibility is that, then ask about that. And if they are more responsible for machine learning, the operations, ML ops, then ask about that. And that's going to be really important to see if they can do this role that you have in your team. I think one mistake I've also seen is it's not even new. It's not a new problem. But since ML was like, quote, unquote, hot, people would maybe think, oh, our company needs like machine learning, but then they didn't sit down and really define like what this is, where this is going to sit, how this is going to fit in the product. So their interview is all over the place because as a friend of mine mentioned, like they want like a unicorn and they don't even know like where they want this unicorn in the company. So
they don't have a space for the unicorn.
yeah, exactly. So just in summary, like it's useful to know where you want this role to be, what skills that would make them contribute to the role, and then build the interview from there to ask the target questions. If you're hiring for more senior people, then the common senior things apply, like, oh, lead a project, mentor people. But I think for ML, for more senior people or just like mid-level, I would expect them to actually have more insight also into the other responsibilities. So let's say someone who's more like mid-level to senior and they're responsible for model training, they will start to have more of a understanding of ML ops and how that works than a more junior person who's focusing on model training. So the more senior you get, the more visibility you need to have like end to end. So I think the interview questions could also try to capture that. Like, have you worked on maybe some other parts of the pipeline, or have you been very focused on this, let's say, model training? But
so
again,
more like the breadth of skills rather than just a narrowness only on focusing model training.
Yeah, or like kind of T-shaped or something like that, because it'll help with the scaling up as people grow into senior, which is the more you've seen end to end, the more you're able to communicate. Because I did a brief stint doing ML ops, and I don't normally do that, but it helped me communicate so much more to anyone that I was working with in the future regarding like how I'd like this, let's say, design to work and things like that. It helps immensely for people who are scaling up. And another thing, I have some more thoughts actually, because for even larger companies, there's definitely more specialization happening. So let's say someone can go really, really deep on model training, like they're a research scientist or something. So there's definitely exceptions where maybe they don't need to know as much about the deployment process, but it still differentiates them. It will differentiate them given another candidate with the exact same skills. Like knowing a bit more about what comes before and what comes after is going to be really useful. But yeah, I think this is like less relevant for like the newcomers, but more about like growing in the ML role. I think actually another thing I want to mention, which is people could interview really well for a certain skill, but if that's not what the company needs, a company with a well-realized vision of what they want to hire, they could still get rejected. So I'm going to bring up I can't share details, but like our team has two broad sections. Like one requires more, let's say, ops skills, and one requires more of the ML modeling skills. So at each time we're hiring, we'll hire someone who might fit one profile more, the other profile more. So what makes an ideal candidate today might not be the ideal candidate next month if we're hiring for the other profile. Because we know what we need on this team and we know what we're missing right now. So I think for people who are interviewing, like it's also a matter of luck almost, or you have to really align with the role in which, let's say they really want to, for people who are coming from a software background, there are teams who at this point in time, they want to leverage your software skills. So then maybe your other skills will matter less. And then sometimes they want to leverage other skills more. So even if the job description doesn't make that very clear, that might be something that holds people back in interviews as well. But it's a bit of luck and what is needed.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of luck, it's just about is there a good fit, right?
Yeah.
And I think the fit is less clear for machine learning jobs than it is for development jobs.
Yes.
But in that sense, maybe we just don't have enough specializations yet, unless people want to apply as prompt engineer. Then
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Susan, for joining the InfoQ podcast and joining us at QCon San Francisco, and hope you have a good time.
Yep, thanks again for having me.